As everybody knows, we've got our cult webcomic author and artist in the studio. And now comics is something that I know from my childhood. I remember really well things like the Beano and Dandy. And to me, that's what comics were until, I met Zoe and she opened my eyes to the world of comics. And I think, it's something that does go back through the ages. Comics are not a new thing. There's something that even our oldest listeners here will probably remember from their own childhood, that there were comics around. I'm thinking of some of the classic names as you go back, The Eagle, Dan Dare, but even things like Spider-Man, Batman, even Dick Tracy, I think, was originally a comic, was it not, Zoe?
Dick Tracy was originally a 3 or 4 panel comic running daily in American newspapers.
So what sort of date would have been on that?
1920s, I think it was. One of the earlier ones for the serialized strip, but not the earliest. The earliest, if I remember correctly, was late 19th century, a 3-panel daily strip called Foxy Grandpa.
All right.
About the adventures of a mischievous grandpa and his little grandchildren.
All right. So, I mean, really, comics are something that go way back through the ages. And I think a lot of people, myself included, before I met you and got to know a lot about the work that you actually do, would look at a comic and think, well, where do you start? How does a comic come to be? Because you've got the story in there. It's telling a story. You've got the dialogue, the script, but you've also got the pictures. Now, what comes first? Do you draw the pictures and think, well, I like this, I'm going to draw this, and then I'm going to think what it's suggesting to me? Or how does a comic start out?
Well, everyone's got their own way of working, but for me, I like to start with the dialogue itself. If you don't have the story and you don't have what the characters are going to say, it's very hard to try and work out what they're going to be doing and what poses to put all the characters in. So I tend to start out with the idea that I'm going to have a story about X, Y, and Z. This is the dialogue I'm going to have. I need a joke here. I need a setup here. And then you work that like that. And it's like taking all the lines and then arranging them on your storyboard effectively. So you've got your story laid out and you say, right, because I need this character to say this here and be doing this here, I need to have them stood here and doing this. And then you get your basic idea of what the artwork's going to look like, and it builds from there.
Right, so basically it's dialogue first, and then, a bit like how maybe something like a film would start out. It starts out as a written script, and
exactly,
from there
yes.
they build up the visual side of it. But do you? I've heard some of the terminology that gets bandied around. Things like people like inkers. There can be more than one person involved with drawing a script. How does that work? Do you share frames? So like you'll say to somebody, I'll draw the first 3, you draw the next 3, or is it much more complex than that?
Again, it depends on the situation. In modern comics, people like Marvel Comics and DC, the ones that produce Spider-Man, Batman, Superman, that kind of thing, everything is very functional. So the writer will write the script, and then it'll be excuse me, sorry. And the writer will write the script, and then it's passed on to a penciler who sketches and draws the basic shape of the artwork from the script. He'll do it in pencil, and then all of that work is passed on to the inker. The inker is the person who defines the artwork by drawing the lines in properly in ink, putting in all of the shading, and basically making the artwork the kind of thing that you'll remember from seeing the old black and white comic strips in the newspaper, or if you're ever a comic fan yourself, the actual line work in the comic. And then that goes on to a colorist. Sometimes it's the inker does the colouring as well, but more often than not in DC Comics and American comics in general, the colorist will be a separate person again who's very skilled in not only putting colours onto the paper but also shading everything so it looks real and has a bit of texture to it.
Right, we've had a few calls actually come in already on Star 800 here on CPR Radio. A few of you seem to actually be listening, really quite interested about this, and there's a couple of questions that I want to put to you, Zoe. Mm-hmm. Richard Johnson has called in, and he asks, he's always been very curious. How big actually is the comic when you draw it? Because obviously you see it in the comic book. Do you actually draw it that size, or do you draw it a different size and then it gets either made bigger or made smaller? And it's just he's quite curious to know.
It's always made smaller. With a standard comic, if you go into a newsagent these days and you pick up something like 2000 AD, the pages are just slightly smaller than A4, but the original artwork will have been between A3 and A2 size.
Oh, right, so they are quite large then.
They are. The standard is about A3 size, so that you've got a lot of space to work with. But not only that, but it can be scanned in very high quality because that really helps define it on the page.
Interesting. And we've got another question here from George Riley, who called in on Star 800. And he's very curious to know what happens to all the artwork, obviously after it's drawn and coloured and the comic is printed. What actually happens to all that original artwork?
It goes back to the artist.
So you're saying a lot of these artists will have quite a large collection of artwork then at home, or do they sell it off? Or
some of it gets sold off, some of it goes into their personal collection. I know one artist who, every time he goes to a comic convention, is asked about a particular picture he drew for the cover of 2000 AD. And he says he'll only sell it for a lot of money because it's his favourite and it's actually hanging on the wall in his living room.
Right, yeah, I suppose so. But also then there's... we've got Julie Moore here has called in on Star 800, and she asks about people, comics like the Beano. She says she remembers it from when she was a child, and she's seen it on the shelves, the bookshelves now, and a lot of the characters, a lot of the strips that are in there, they look exactly the same as they did 30, 40, 50 years ago. And she asks, will it have been the same person drawing these all the way through, and if not, how can they get different people to draw exactly the same?
One of the things that you do when you're starting out as a comic artist especially is to copy the artwork of a person that you really admire as an artist. And in the case of myself, I used to read the Dandy and the Beano, and I would copy religiously the way that Desperate Dan and Dennis the Menace were drawn, so it helped me develop my own personal style. But in the case of DC Thompson, especially with the Dandy and the Beano, for decades they've had what's called a house artistic style, where they will have a copy of a few pictures of Desperate Dan, Dennis the Menace, Minnie the Minx, and all of the other ones from different angles, the front, the side, the back, and things like that. And the artist will be required to stick as rigidly to this particular style as they can, so that every time you pick up a copy of the Beano, it looks the same. Because children like the familiarity. They can instantly look at a character and say, that is Dennis the Menace.
Yeah, and also I suppose if the characters suddenly changed slightly, then people would... especially younger people might have more difficulty in accepting this change to something that they've come to be very familiar with.
Exactly. And also, the thing with children is recognition isn't quite as solid as it is with adults. It develops. So if you've got a character that looks the same all the time, they will instantly know that's who this is.